Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be tuning in to this GMAT Club live session. We're really excited to be here today. My name is Doris Huang. I am a senior consultant specializing in MBAs with Admissionado. We are a longtime partner of GMAT Club. We do boutique admissions consulting for college and graduate school. Again, this session is going to be focused on MBAs and top business schools. So thank you for tuning in. Let me go ahead and share with you a presentation that I prepared for this session. And I'll give you a bit of an overview as to what to expect for the next hour or so as you listen in. Hopefully you all can see my screen now. Again, Admissionado, we're super excited to be here today. This particular session is called Tale of Three Successful Applicants from Overrepresented Application Pools. So what exactly does this mean? Why should you be listening in for this, again, like I said, this next hour? This session is all going to be about how to stand out in especially competitive applicant pools. So many GMAT Club audience members that we speak to on the forums are concerned because they come from perhaps countries like India and China that are very heavily represented in top MBA application pools. Maybe they have a background like engineering or finance that they find super competitive. So common questions that we get from these groups is, well, how am I supposed to rise to the top here when there's so many people of my demographic who are applying and who are all super competitive? So if that is you, if you're worried about that in your MBA applications, you've come to the right place. We're going to talk about three specific case studies today. These are all real clients that we've had at Admissionado in the past. We've changed their names to protect their privacy, but the details are, again, anonymized, but they're real people. And we've picked these three people because they represent different attributes of these pools that are overrepresented. So before I dive into the specifics, let me just speak briefly again about myself. So again, my name is Doris, and my personal background is I have an undergraduate degree in political science from Harvard, a master's in Latin American studies from Oxford in England, and my MBA from Wharton. So I've had a good amount of experience with different types of schooling, and I love being able to apply everything that I've learned in my academic experience to clients nowadays who are interested in pursuing their own academic and professional goals. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. You're going to see this framework repeated for the next three case studies. Let me just pause for a minute and explain what you're looking at. I know the slide looks pretty blank right now. We'll fill it in a minute. For each of our case studies, what we've done is we've identified the specific, like I said, attributes or qualities that might be assigned to some of these overrepresented pools. In this first case, we have a white male applicant who came from a consulting background and wanted to switch careers after business school. So those are the three elements of this particular applicant's case study. I wanted to get all of you thinking about this question of how do I stand out in a pool like this is I want you to put yourself in the shoes of the adcom or the admissions committee, okay? On the left-hand side, we're going to look at what I'm calling strikes against you. So if you come from one of these pools, what are these strikes that the adcom might put against you for having come from one of these pools? It's not always fair. It may not be true, whatever the stereotype is or the concern about your demographic, but unfortunately, that's the reality you have to deal with. So the sooner you understand that strike against you, the sooner you can prepare yourself to counter-strike it. And this is the right-hand side of the page. How can you break out of this mold that the adcom might be tempted to put you into, given your demographic profile? Okay, so this is the basic framework. You're going to see it repeated for the next three case studies. So let's start with this first one here. Let's talk a little bit about white males in the MBA applicant population and what the strike against them is. So this one, this has been in the news a lot recently, and again, whether it's true or not, and of course, individual circumstances vary a lot, but unfortunately, we are talking about broad demographic groups here. White males historically have had certain privileges, structural privileges, societal privileges that other demographic groups, such as, for example, women or perhaps racial or ethnic minorities, may not have had as much access to. This is a historical trend, right? Well, what do you do about this if you're a white male applicant? Obviously, you can't change it on some level, right? It is what it is, and you have to accept that. You don't have to apologize for it either, but can you show in your application other ways in which you've lifted other people up with you as on your own climb to the top, on your own journey to wherever you are today and where you hope to go in the future? How inclusive are you? Some examples of this are mentoring younger colleagues, training, Have you shown examples of how you have made an active effort to do these things in your career? That's one of the best ways to address this strike. Consulting's a big one. And the tricky thing here is with, obviously there's many different tiers of management consulting firms. The challenge here is that the top firms, McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, are famous MBB. You could fill an entire HBS, Wharton, and Stanford class every single year with just MBB consultants, practically speaking, from around the world, right? So how do you stand out amongst a crowd of those firms sending these employees, especially if you're not from one of those top firms, which, by the way, is the case for many of our applicants and clients that we work with? Well, the key here is to stand out from the crowd of fellow consultants. So you have to compare yourself with your peer group. Good ways to show that you've risen to the top include, have you been promoted faster than most of your peers? Have you been ranked among the top X% of your analyst class if your firm does rankings? And or especially if you come from a non-MBB firm, has the boutique size of your consulting firm perhaps allowed you to take on more responsibility, more client exposure, more senior work, team leadership than you would have otherwise, right? So you want to show how you are really separating yourself from the pack of fellow consultants, whether it's within the MBB world, if that's where you come from, or within whatever tier consulting firm you come from. The other way to look at this also is what we call firm extracurriculars. So consultants are very busy people, we know this. And oftentimes you don't have time to do volunteering work or to really pursue extracurriculars outside of your day job. But we've seen many successful applicants from both MBB and non-MBB firms who stand out by really getting involved in firm committees, right? So this could be a women's committee, it could be a diversity initiative, or it could be things like wellness, health and wellness, sports leagues, right? Have you shown yourself to be somebody who really devotes yourself wholeheartedly to the community that you're a part of, which in this case might be your employer? And the third element that I want to look at here for this applicant is a career switcher, right? So many applicants, thousands of applicants every year say that they want to switch careers after business school. Oftentimes it's completely legitimate, but the adcom is going to question whether this career switch actually makes sense for you given your background. If you don't have any experience or any skills or exposure to the field that you say you want to go into prior to business school, how realistic is it that you're really going to be able to get a job post-MBA in that field? Now, the way to address this one head on is to take a good hard look at what we call your career arc. So your career arc is the story of your career, starting with your undergraduate degree. What are all the transition points that you've gone through your career so far? And why did you make those transitions at those times? Can you see a trail of what we call breadcrumbs? These are like little clues sprinkled through your career arc that show that you do have a long-standing interest or knowledge of this field that you want to switch into. So ideally, you have actual professional experience in this field. Perhaps if you're a consultant, you might have worked on one project, and let's say you want to go into media and entertainment, which is the case with this applicant, as you'll see in a minute. Have you worked with a media client? Have you worked with an entertainment client? That's obviously ideal, but many people don't have professional or conferences, organizations that had to do with media and entertainment. Have you, outside of work, if you've had the time and the capacity to, have you stayed active and involved in that community? And then it's also important to be able to understand how the MBA is going to help you bridge that gap between what you've currently done and what you want to do in the future. If you can be very specific about what you need to learn in business school that will help you get to your future career goal in a new field, that's much more compelling to the adcom than simply saying, I want to switch careers and not having any clue as to what the actual concrete steps are to get you there. So this is the framework for these particular aspects of an overrepresented pool. Let's take a look at William. Again, an actual client of ours. We've changed some of the details here, but William, just to give you a quick overview of who he was, is a 27-year-old Caucasian male by the time he came to work with us at Admissionato. This is a few years ago. His undergraduate degree was in commerce from the University of Virginia. This is a very highly ranked public university in the United States, but he had a 3.3 GPA and a 700 GMAT. In terms of his work experience, he had worked for 4 years at the same company, a non-MBB regional boutique management consulting firm. And in that firm, he was extremely active. So I mentioned firm extracurriculars a minute ago. He was somebody who was very involved in recruiting and training for his firm for new joiners. But he also was involved in social impact consulting that his firm did for local nonprofits pro bono. He wanted to go into media and entertainment after business school, but interestingly, what I would call new media. So he was less interested in traditional studios like Disney and Universal, and he was more interested in this new wave of data-driven, content-driven streaming media. So Amazon, Netflix, Hulu, companies like that. So very different. Obviously, he doesn't have that in his background, as you can see. At the end of the day, though, he was accepted to some wonderful programs. He chose to go to UCLA, but he also had other options on the table that were really terrific. And he chose to go to UCLA because of its proximity to media, and obviously being in California on the West Coast, the proximity as well to tech companies. So let's talk a little bit about how William stood out. He was a white male consultant, non-MBB, and he wanted to switch careers. So how did he make the case for himself? Let's go point by point. So in terms of the white male strike, William was quite young. Like I said, at the time he applied, he had only had 4 years of work experience, but he had already led entire teams for his firm. And this is because his firm was a smaller size. So he had the ability to really rise to the top with his performance. He also, I mentioned this, was a very active recruiter of new employees from his alma mater, from the University of Virginia. And he took on a very active role mentoring new analysts who joined his firm as well. So clearly somebody who has not only looked out for his own career, but has figured out ways to lift up others with him. In terms of his management consulting background, what was really cool here was that William actually turned the fact that his employer was not an MBB firm into an advantage. And this was mostly about showing how the firm's small size and boutique client portfolio allowed him to really punch above his weight. So he was a self-starter. He's somebody who really was very driven by his own internal motivations. And so in this small environment, he was really able to rise to the top. He gained a lot of exposure despite being pretty young. So he was doing work that perhaps in some other firms, a post-MBA associate or even a junior level partner might be doing in terms of selling cases to new clients. And I mentioned before also, he was extremely active in firm committees and also in volunteer consulting projects that his firm set up with local nonprofits. He actually had even gone out and recruited some nonprofits to work with his firm. Finally, in terms of switching careers, again, going from consulting to media and entertainment, and I will say that most of William's clients prior to business school were in the healthcare space, so really unrelated to entertainment. But what was interesting here was William had a real knack for storytelling. And this is something consultants do all the time. They have to weave a story together that paints a picture of the business problem and the solution for a client. So William was exceptionally talented at this. In fact, one of his most successful projects, which he wrote about in his essays and also his recommenders wrote about as well, had to do with creating an exposition for a client that was going to be a public exposition in the sector. And this involved designing interactive exhibits, that told a story. And these stories were based on data analysis, which he was also very, very skilled at, big data. And what's interesting is these are the exact two things that a lot of firms like Amazon and Netflix look for in recruiting their teams for their new media entertainment initiatives. So they look for people who understand big data and understand how to glean insights from big data, but they also have to tell a story at the end of the day. So William actually had these breadcrumbs in his pre-MBA experience, despite the fact that on paper, it wasn't obvious at first that he'd be really great at this future career field. So that's William. Let's take a pause for a minute. I hope that makes sense to all of you. This framework that we're going to use, and you're going to see it 2 more times. So hopefully by the end of this presentation, it'll be seared into your memory. And again, like I said, we're going to go through 2 other candidates here who we worked with in the past with different elements to their background. So hopefully you'll find something here that is going to resonate with you if William's story doesn't connect. Let's move on to case study number 2. This gentleman was an Indian engineer. And we know that amongst the GMAT Club audience, many of you identify with this profile. So this is going to come as very obvious, I think, to everybody on this live stream. I don't need to delve into too much detail here. You're going to know that one of the big strikes against the Indian engineer or computer science background is there's a stereotype that these candidates are highly technically skilled, but there's a question about whether they really have the makings of future business leaders. Are they going to be fantastic engineers for their entire careers or fantastic coders, programmers? But are they never going to quite be able to cross that boundary into business management? Because at the end of the day, this is business school. These are not PhD programs in electrical engineering or computer science, right? So the way to break the mold here is to show examples of your business acumen, not just your technical credentials. So can you demonstrate that you have actually worked on product strategy or on corporate strategy? Have you perhaps even led a P&L, a profit and loss statement? Have you been responsible for a specific division, or even if it's a small product within your company, have you been responsible for making business decisions, not just technical decisions around that product's rollout and launch? Also, a really great way to break the mold here is to highlight your soft skills. So you have the hard skills, which are your engineering or your programming skills, and there's many ways in which you can demonstrate that you're outstanding at that, of course. But also there's the people side of the equation, right? And businesses at the end of the day are about people. Are there stories that you can draw from on your communication skills, team building, collaboration, leadership, mentoring? These are all elements of what we call your soft skills. The other strike that many Indian applicants have to contend with is that mean standardized test scores, this is for GMAT or GRE, do tend to skew high for Indian applicants compared to other pools. And this speaks a lot to the academic prowess of this group, of this demographic group. But unfortunately, it makes it tough if you're a member of this group. How do you stand out? You know, if you get a really high score, it may not be as exceptional as it would be for some other demographics. And if you don't get as high of a score as your fellow Indian applicants, let's say, how do you explain that? So if your GMAT or GRE score is relatively low for your population, what I recommend is that you focus on other areas of your application that can demonstrate that you have the academic aptitude to handle MBA level work. So there might be an area of weakness, perhaps, again, usually with this group, you see a higher quant score and a lower verbal score. That's not always the case, but perhaps there's a focused weakness like that. So one way to sort of address that weakness is to say, look, I'm going to point to examples from my undergraduate or graduate work that show that I have the training. Let's say your quant score is weaker and you've actually done a lot of coursework in undergrad on quantitative subjects. You know, you had a really great GPA. That's a really good way to assure the adcom that you have the ability to handle this MBA coursework. It could be professional certifications like chartered accountancy or other qualifications that are specific to your field. And then doing online coursework. I've seen a lot of clients who've taken online classes, these free online classes that are available very widely now. Some of them are run by Ivy League professors. That's a good way to demonstrate that you recognize you have a vulnerability and you're working to shore it up. So again, here at the end of the day, you have to convince the admissions committee that you are able to do MBA level work, both on the verbal side and on the quantitative side. So the GMAT or GRE is usually a very good barometer of that. But if you didn't do as well on that test, there are other ways to demonstrate that you have that academic aptitude. So let's talk about the specific case study who inspired this part of the presentation. We're going to call him Abhishek here. And in his case, he was 28 years old, Indian male, by the time that he applied. He had an undergraduate degree in EE, electrical engineering, from IIT. But before you say, wow, IIT, look at his GPA. He had a 6.5 out of 10. He did 740 on the GMAT. And by the time he applied, he had 5 years of experience in oil field services at Baker Hughes, which is a large multinational oil field services company. He'd been promoted twice during this time. So he was an oil and gas engineer. In terms of extracurriculars, he had founded a few student clubs while he was at IIT. And then also at Baker Hughes, he actually founded 1 or 2 extracurricular interest groups for his colleagues. And he also, being an oil gas engineer, he was primarily stationed in the Middle East. And while he was working in Bahrain, he became very interested in the plight of migrant workers, and many of whom were from the South Asian subcontinent. And he did quite a bit of charity work with them while he was stationed in Bahrain. His post-MBA goal was actually to switch into management consulting, so a little bit of a shift to more of an advisory role. He did eventually want to specialize in oil and gas, but one of the things that we spoke to Abhishek about was the fact that, especially the MBB firms, but really any of these management consulting firms that are recruiting out of business school, when they first bring you on board, they don't want you to specialize. They want you to get a broad general background in a number of different fields, working for different types of companies. And this is to develop your education, really. So it was unlikely that right off the bat, he would be able to specialize in oil and gas, which was his ultimate goal. But he understood, the benefits of getting a generalist education for the first couple of years. And then given his background, it was a very obvious choice for his future employer to put him on oil and gas projects. Ultimately, he was accepted to a number of the top MBA programs, mostly in Europe. That was his area of interest, and Rotman, which is in Canada as well. He decided to go to Cambridge Judge at the end of the day in England. So how did he succeed at standing out from the Indian engineer population? First of all, with regards to this question of soft skills or business acumen, it turns out that Abhishek, besides being a fantastic oil and gas engineer, he had a real talent for connecting with people. He, all the way back at IIT, he'd actually founded a stand-up comedy club. Turns out he had a terrific sense of humor and really liked to use humor as a means of connecting with other people who might be from very different backgrounds from him. And, he parlayed that ability to work with people into being entrusted with very senior client relationships at Baker Hughes early on. Remember, he was not a project manager, he was an engineer, but his ability to connect with people was recognized by his superiors, and they gave him a responsibility managing client relationships. Right, so as I said here, he showed that he was a true people person in addition to being an outstanding engineer. In terms of his GPA, his test score, like I said, his GMAT is strong, obviously at a 740, but his GPA was very low, especially for, again, an Indian applicant. And it took some of the shine off his IIT degree. It raised some questions about what had happened while he was an undergrad. So he did take advantage of this optional essay, which we get a lot of questions about. Most of the time, for the majority of applicants, the optional essay is not necessary. If anything, it distracts from the main part of your application. But in this case, he had to explain his low GPA. So he wrote a brief essay explaining how it was a struggle at the beginning for IIT when he made the transition. First of all, he'd come from a small rural town. Moving to IIT was a real shock, and it required some time for him to transition properly to this new world. Also, as you saw, he was very active in extracurriculars, perhaps a little bit too active at first. Maybe he bit off more than he could chew. So it took him some time also to balance his academic commitments with his extracurricular leadership roles, and that explained why his performance was not so great at the beginning. So that's Abhishek. Hopefully that resonates with some of you on this live stream. We're going to go ahead and transition to our third and final case study here. So the elements we wanted to tackle with this example are a Chinese applicant coming from finance, and this person wanted to move into social impact work after business school. And so you're going to see a little bit of repetition from the previous case study because there's certain overlap between the Chinese and Indian demographics. And by the way, that can encompass, any East Asian country, any South Asian country. These particular people happen to be Indian and Chinese, respectively. And then engineering and finance, sometimes there's certain overlaps in terms of those fields as well. So you're going to see a little bit of redundancy here. So the first strike against Chinese applicants is the same as for Indian applicants. It's a high scoring group with a GMAT and a GRE. So really, this is the exact same point from before. In terms of people coming from finance, on the one hand, one would assume that finance candidates are very welcome at top MBA programs. Of course they are, but there's a lot of them, right? So there's a little bit of the same problem we had before with management consultants, where it's just the sheer volume of professionals coming from this background is high enough that you could fill an entire class of top MBA programs each year just with folks with a finance background. And of course, finance is a highly diversified field. There's many examples of finance within it. The unwanted stereotype that we have to combat here if you come from finance is that of the finance jock. So this is, numbers whiz who's really great with spreadsheets or with trading platforms, but has terrible people skills. And as I said here, movies like The Wolf of Wall Street don't exactly help this reputation, right? So again, it's a stereotype. It doesn't apply to everybody, but that's what you're fighting against. In this case, again, our advice is very similar to what we said to engineering or computer science professionals as well. It's about showcasing your soft skills. How are you a human leader, right? How have you had a positive impact on other people, whether this is your coworkers, your direct reports, if you have anyone reporting to you, your clients, anyone that you interact with, really. What examples can you give of your teamwork skills, your leadership skills, your communication skills? This is how you fight against this strike. Finally, this last point here about working in social impact, again, there's a little bit of overlap between this point and the point we made earlier in William's case study about people who want to switch careers. So you have many, many applicants who claim that after business school, they want to work in social impact, whether that's directly in nonprofit operations or management, or if they want to take on a consulting role or perhaps impact investing. These fields they're trendy. However, they're also very narrow fields. They're highly selective. There's not that many organizations or companies, funds, foundations that really have the means to hire top MBAs, because MBAs are expensive, and they're looking for compensation that's commensurate to their degree and their preparation. So there's only really a very small list of places that people who want to work in social impact after business school can legitimately work. And so the skepticism that the adcom often has here is, well, first of all, does this candidate really know what they're talking about? Do they know what they're getting into? They say they want to work in social impact. Do they really? Do they really know, what that's like and what that's about? And then number two, we know there's very few slots. It's actually similar in some ways to people who say they want to go into venture capital or into private equity or hedge funds after business school. Those are highly selective fields. There's really not many roles that open up every year. And so the adcom is just, they just have a little bit of hesitancy around these applications for that reason, because they know that unlike consulting, unlike investment banking, where job placement is relatively easy, these fields are very tough to get into. So here, how do you break the mold? Well, the adcom wants to see that you've really put your money where your mouth is, that you really know what you're talking about, ideally through having direct experience with social impact work. Again, the principle applies here if you have actual work projects related to social impact. Let's say, again, if you're in management consulting and you've done a pro bono project or two for a nonprofit, that's ideal. But for many people, that's simply not the case, in which case you should probably draw from examples of volunteer work, charity involvement, ideally after undergrad, right? Because we're talking about business school here. They're looking for people who have at least a few years of work experience. So if you have to reach back as far as undergrad, it doesn't look great, because it shows that you haven't really kept up that commitment to the nonprofit sector or to social causes since you started working. And again, the adcom knows that you're busy, and some fields are, especially if you come from finance or consulting, you may not have that much time. But if you really care about social impact work, probably you found a way to stay involved, even if it's just through, minimal volunteering, or perhaps donations or being on a fundraising committee. It's best if you can show that you have some sort of track record of involvement after undergrad. The candidate we have here to illustrate this group her name is Amy. And Amy was a 27-year-old Chinese woman when she came to us. She had immigrated to the United States pretty late in life. I think it was the beginning of high school. She did her finance degree undergrad at the University of Michigan, another top-tier public university in America, with a 3.6 GPA and a 710 on her GMAT. She had worked in 4 years in corporate banking and leveraged finance at Crédit Agricole, which is it's certainly one of the largest banks globally, but it's not what we call a bulge bracket firm. So it's not a Goldman Sachs. It's not a, pre 2008 Lehman Brothers would have been a bulge bracket example as well. It's not one of these sort of top tier banks. And she was actually very actively involved. We'll talk about this in a minute, in gala committees for children's charities in the New York area where she was based. She wanted to go into social impact investing after business school. We'll talk more about this in a minute. She was ultimately accepted to Wharton, Yale, Sloan, and Booth, so terrific programs. And she did choose to go to Wharton because of its focus on finance specifically. So how did Amy stand out from the crowd? Well, let's talk about her academics first, right? Standardized test scores again, and GPA. So she went to a very prestigious university, but her GPA at a 3.6 wasn't outstanding. It was good, it was solid, but it wasn't terrific. And her GMAT at 710, same thing. It was a good score, but it wasn't exceptional, especially for a Chinese applicant. It turns out in Amy's particular case, both of these things, the GPA and the GMAT being low, could largely be explained by the verbal side of things. So it was really due to the fact that her English language skills were pretty recently acquired, since she had come only as a teenager to America. So she also used the optional essay in this case, didn't do a whole song and dance, but just very, in a couple of sentences, explained that this was her situation, her immigration background. And she explained that that's why her GPA and her GMAT weren't as strong as perhaps they could have been. Now, I want to just point out here for a minute, because we have many GMAT club members who are concerned about English being a second language, or perhaps learned later in life, and how is that going to affect their chances in business school. Having been to business school, and all of us consultants in Mission Ed have come from the top programs, I will tell you, the majority of people enrolled at these top business school programs are bilingual, whether or not English is their first or second language or third or fourth language in some cases. Most people are multilingual, and that's actually seen as a benefit, as an advantage in business school. That's something that they want to recruit for. If you're not super comfortable with your English language skills, and typically this becomes more of a barrier when you get to the interview stage, right? And you're kind of put on the spot and you have to answer questions in English off the cuff. The key really here is to practice, practice, practice. So in Amy's case, when she got to the interview rounds, and again, you saw the number of schools she got into, she had several interviews. We did a lot of hands-on prep with what we call the STAR framework. This is many of you probably know what this is. It's a framework for preparing for how to answer specific questions in English. And we just really drilled her on this, and she became more and more confident over time. And by the time she got to Wharton, she realized that, obviously, she was concerned about her English language skills not being strong enough, but it turned out that once she built up her confidence, she actually was in a much better position than she thought she was. And we find that's often the case with many of our clients who do not speak English as a first language. Typically, they speak it more than well enough to do well at business school, but it's about confidence. With regards to the finance track stereotype here, what Amy focused on in her essays to counter this strike is she had taken on leadership roles for multiple charity galas. I mentioned this on the previous slide. It turns out she's actually very, very adept at organizing large-scale events and rallying people around a common cause. So one gala, for example, for which she served as the Young Professionals Chair, actually doubled the funds they raised that year to $650,000. So you could see there was a direct impact between her participation, her leadership in that year, and the end result, right? So adcoms love to see that you've made a very specific and concrete contribution to your organization. And again, here it's not, the result is fantastic, but it was also about the process, the means to the end, how Amy used her skills, like I said, rallying people around a common cause to pull off a very large event and to raise a large amount of money for this nonprofit. So clearly she's somebody who has influence and knows how to wield it and knows how to shepherd large groups of people towards a common mission. Finally, in terms of social impact, Amy did a lot of legwork here. So it turns out while she was at Credit Agricole, she actually did have experience with a few deals that involved triple bottom line investing. So this is where investment products are focused not just on financial profit, but also on social and environmental impacts. In this case, there were loan products linked to sustainability, so linked to things like carbon emissions, right, that she had directly been involved in closing some of these deals. So she was able to talk about that and, her understanding of that particular type of investing and what drew her to it. She also spent a lot of time before she applied networking with very specific impact investing groups in China and Singapore. So she's a Mandarin speaker. She thought that most likely after business school, she would return to the Mandarin speaking world. And so she actually went and she found specific funds. And these are funds where alumni from her target schools actually worked. So you see how not only was the specificity, compelling that she had found, a few specific firms that she could work at, but they were real paths for her because people from these business schools that she was applying to had actually gone and worked there, right? So you see how this is a very concrete path that she had researched very closely. So she proved to the adcom that this was going to be a realistic post-MBA opportunity for her. So that's it for these three cases. I hope you understand, having gone through it 3 times, how this framework works and how these 3 specific people managed to really stand out from the crowd. I'm going to go ahead and put up this end slide for just a minute. If you're interested in talking to us about your specific case, if you found that one of these case studies really resonated with you, or if you have perhaps a different element to your demographic profile that we didn't address specifically, but you want to run it by us, feel free to reach out. That's our website, www.admissionnato.com. We have an info@ email box that we check constantly. So feel free to drop us a line. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this presentation now. And we'll see if you have any questions about any of these examples for me. Great. Walton is telling me that he comes from non-MBB consulting, gained some ideas for shaping your story. That's awesome, Walton. Glad to hear it. At the end of the day, too, I want to make sure this is a good time to say, don't get too hung up on the specific details of the candidates that we provided. That was really just to illustrate some examples for you. At the end of the day, you need to tell your story, right? And remember, the adcoms see thousands of these applicants a year, so it becomes pretty obvious to them if you're latching onto someone else's story and trying to shoehorn yourself into that, framework. It needs to come from you. It needs to be real, authentic from your experience. So hopefully this just inspired you to think of ways in which, your stories might fit. And, at the end of the day, it's about getting you to think a certain way and apply that lens, that framework to your own life. Thanks, Walton. Okay, so we have a question from Pratik. Would an Indian telecom engineer from the oil and gas sector count in a represented group? Generally, engineers, broadly speaking, right? Of course, engineering comes in many flavors and colors. And there's some, I would say, from our experience, engineers who come from more of like a double E background or who are doing programming, coding, working computer science fields, that tends to be the most represented group. But, adcoms do tend to look at engineers as a whole as having a certain kind of formation, a certain kind of training. And so, yes, I would say that is probably an overrepresented group, and many of the same ideas that we spoke about in this presentation, especially with that second case study with Abhishek, would still apply in this case. So you do have to make sure you're thinking about those and getting ahead of them in your application. Great. Thanks, Walton, for more details about your focus. That's great. Energy practice. Do you think sustainability will be overused by other applicants? Sustainability, it's tough because on the one hand, sustainability is truly one of the challenges of our time. And businesses in every single sector have to think about sustainability for the long term, right? If they're going to survive, if they're going to maintain their profits, they have to think about sustainable practices. So on the one hand, it is a real problem. And so if you write about it, it's not disingenuous. On the other hand, it's true that a lot of applicants, those who want to go into especially social impact work, do write about sustainability. So I think the key here is making sure that you're not just throwing around sustainability as a buzzword, but rather that you really understand what you're talking about. You've either had direct work experience with sustainability related product or projects in your field, like look at Amy, right? She had actually worked on sustainability linked loans, so she knew what she was talking about. Or if you don't have that hands-on experience, then the key becomes, have you done your homework? Have you researched? There's so many articles published nowadays. You could read for days on end about different, specific segments within sustainability, whether it's renewable energy, whether it's material sourcing, whatever it is. You could educate yourself very easily online for free. So have you done your homework? Can you convince the adcom that you know what you're talking about? Again, you're not just using a trendy word, but you actually understand sustainability as it applies to your field. That's the key. A question from Aditya. How do we present our side of the story in case of impact worth mentioning that resulted from team effort, right? You made key decisions in that. How much leeway do we have there? So adcoms understand that, look, if you're applying to business school, most likely you're pretty early in your career, and chances are that you're not an executive who's leading entire divisions of hundreds of people, right? So yes, and by the way, decision-making and leadership doesn't always boil down to one person. Typically, it is about getting other people on board with you, getting them across the finish line to support an idea that you're advocating for. So I think this is a great way to demonstrate not only that you have the presence to lead a group, but that also you have the influence skills, the persuasion skills that are necessary to get a team to get to a specific outcome or conclusion. So yes, I think it's important here to make sure you're clear about what your role was within the team. So do not take credit for what other people did. That's very dangerous. It's not, in addition to being unethical, right? So be clear. If a contribution was someone else's, was due to someone else's work, give them credit where credit is due. That's what good leaders do. But explain, what your role was in working vis-a-vis other team members to get to that outcome. And that's a good way to explain how leadership doesn't just look like top-down hierarchical leadership, but it can also be peer-to-peer, right? How do you influence people who don't report to you? That, in fact, is something that's more powerful than if you told your direct report to do X, Y, or Z. Sangeeta is asking if Nepali from a banking sector would count. In Nepal is interesting. We don't see typically as many candidates from Nepal specifically. So in that sense, that's not an overrepresented group. But banking is, very highly represented in most MBA applicant circles. So I would say, pay attention to what I said about finance. And I think to the extent that Nepal, broadly speaking, being an Asian country, there's many of the same cultural elements that make, let's say, Indian or Chinese applicants so academically strong. Those could apply in the case of a Nepali applicant as well. Yeah, certainly keep that in mind. And I think one thing I want to make clear here is it's not a matter of do I fit in one of these overrepresented groups, and should I be extra worried about this, or am I good because I don't fit in one of these groups, so I don't have to worry about any of this? That's certainly not the takeaway here, right? You could be somebody who's coming from, Algeria, and you could work in farming, and you could be a woman, right? I mean, that you think, wow, that person's gonna have a great shot. Not necessarily. You still have to, again, it's about this framework that I've presented here today. How do you think like the adcom? How do you put the adcom's lens on your application? And how do you want to be your own biggest critic when you're applying to business school? What are the holes that you would poke in your own application if you were evaluating it from the adcom's perspective, right? That's what this is about, is getting you to think like the adcom and think, okay, what might be some of the preconceptions, the assumptions, the biases working against me, whatever my background may be. Again, it may not be fair, it may not be true, but unfortunately, that's just the reality of the situation, right? What are those preconceptions, and how can I get ahead of them? How can I address them, combat them head on with examples from my personal story? That's really how we want to get you thinking to be successful. I have a question here about how much representation is applicants from Indian subcontinent, not India, have in business schools? So yeah, this is a good segue from the previous question: Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, etc. Obviously, it's just at the end of the day, it's a matter of, on some level, population numbers, right? India being such an enormous country, same thing with China, right? Such an enormous country. Applicants from those countries tend to dwarf applicants from neighboring countries just by sheer size of the population, right? So that's something, first of all, let's be realistic about that. Second of all, look, Bhutan, I can tell you right now, I have never actually encountered a client from Bhutan, nor have I, in my own business school experience, met anybody from Bhutan who went to business school. So I can say, there are examples here where specific nations do send very few people to top MBA programs. And how much of that, though, is a dynamic that's linked to demand and supply, right? How many people from Bhutan are seeking top MBAs? I don't know the answer to that question, right? Those are stats that aren't published. And is that what explains, why there's very low representation? It's unclear. But I would say generally, right, if there are these stereotypes that we spoke about do apply, broadly speaking. They don't stop at national boundaries, right? We know for a fact that, again, sort of in Asian cultures generally, education is a very high priority. And parents, grandparents, and parents dedicate a lot of resources. Communities, schools dedicate a lot of resources to academic preparation of their students. So that is a cultural phenomenon, by the way, which is a very positive phenomenon that's going to bleed across national borders, right? So it is something, again, if you're from one of these regions generally, it's something you have to be aware of. But yes, of course, there are always specific examples of, very typically, again, smaller countries that don't send a lot of people to top business schools. And if that's the case, then that should be a point of strength that you leverage. You say, look, I'm from Bhutan. Very few people in my country study abroad or get a top MBA, and here's how I want to represent my country to move the economy forward. That could be a strength. But don't forget that at the end of the day, there are all these cultural currents, is what we're talking about, that shape some of these stereotypes that you have to be aware of. What are some examples of unique applicants, right? So, the fictitious example I gave of an Algerian female farmer, right? Just, you don't see that. But again, that's often because, a lot of people in the agricultural sector don't go into MBAs, right? At the end of the day, keep in mind, everybody, that there's a lot of self-selection that goes into business school applications, right? Someone who's working in farming, to use that example, it's possible, unless they work for a big multinational, ag corporation, unless that's the case, chances are that an MBA doesn't make sense for their career. It's a large investment and it may not pay off in the field that they work in. So, unique applicants, sometimes you'll see people who've, started companies and that have actually scaled up to quite a large, level in terms of customers or revenues. That's pretty rare just because that level of success in entrepreneurship is quite rare. So sometimes it's a specific field that you don't see that often. I actually spoke to a client the other day who, as it turns out, did come from farming, but was taking over a family business and actually wanted to get out of farming. So I can't really say that there's that many applicants that I've seen who really stand out just on paper alone based on their demographics, because it is a self-selecting pool. Because we're not talking about college admissions here, where, even then, right, there's a self-selection in terms of who wants to go to university. But we're talking about a really specialized field, which is business school. And so typically you're going to see, 90% of the people, 95% of the people share some degree of, look, I work in finance or consulting or corporate or, and I want to stay in one of those fields going forward. Any other questions? Great. Thanks, Abhijit. Any final thoughts? Let me just wrap up real quick here by saying, what is it today? It's August 3rd. We're about to go into peak season for round 1 applications, and round 2 is on many people's minds because the end of the year will come before we know it. Again, what I would love for you to take away from this is not so much, what is the specific point that I have to make in order to convince the adcom that I'm not like all other Indian applicants, or I'm not like all other consulting applicants. That's less important than walking away from this, understanding the framework of what we're trying to present today, which is think like the adcom, right? Put yourself in their shoes. They're seeing thousands of applications. They have to select the 800 or the 300 that they think are going to make the biggest impact in their future careers down the line. How do you do that? They want to look for people who are going to stand out. So I think if you can understand the stereotypes or the common beliefs about a specific demographic that you might belong to, if you can understand that conception, then you can strategize for how to address it, given your specific details in your own personal background, your academic background or your professional background. That is the key that I want you to walk away with. So, and that should address many of your questions. As people say, well, what about my specific situation? If you understand the framework, you can apply that same framework to your specific situation and it will work for you. So best of luck to all of you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and reach out to us on admissionauto.com if you have further questions. Thanks.